All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming out. It's awesome to see so many people here. We're just going to jump right in since we're already past noon. We're going to be talking about classism today. So, why is this important? It's kind of rhetorical, right? But part of it is they say we have a poor problem, right? Here at this school, we talk a lot about poverty and poverty being a risk factor for adverse health outcomes, right? And that's very much true. In fact, almost half of children living in the U.S. right now are in poverty, which means between 0 and 199% of the federal poverty line. And of those, half of them, so about 25%, are at 100% or low, which is even poorer than the poorest. But what about a rich problem, the flip side of that, right? We can't have poverty without wealth, right? Like they're always on a seesaw. And this is also true, but why talk about it right here, right now? One of the reasons is because of the institution we're at. This data comes from, let me see if this, yes, it does work, cool. This data is where the top 1% of families, economically speaking, and the bottom 20% go to college. And the size of the box is what percentage of students at that institution come from the top 1% of wealth families. So you can see right there, we have Tulane. And this is not specific to the School of Public Health. This is university-wide. But I think this is a pretty appropriate place to be talking about classism. Yeah? Cool. Also, just real quick side note, I just came from the ICE office, immigration, to support a guy named Gustavo here in the community who is at risk of being deported or detained today for a whole bunch of factors. So as we move forward, I want to kind of keep him on our hearts and just kind of keep him in your head as we move forward, because what's happening to him at this very moment right down the street is a direct result of classism and a lot of other systemic inequities. So I feel like before we can start really jumping into a discussion around classism, we have to get on the same page around terms. So starting with the basics, we have class. What are the two main categories we usually hear around class? You can just shout it out. Or, yeah, what's the more crass version of that? Thank you. So while that's true, that is also very binary, right? And there's a whole spectrum in between. And one person's rich is another person's poor, and another person's poor is another person's rich, depending on context, right? So here are just some class categories that are used by people who work on kind of undoing classism, but even within this, they're still limited. So we have the chronically unemployed. That would be folks who do not have regular income, and that could be because of disabilities, because of old age, a whole number of reasons. We have the working class, and that's what we usually associate with blue-collar workers, but really the working class has a lot of subdivisions. There's working poor, so that means people who are working, maybe minimum wage, maybe below minimum wage, maybe day laborers, who just cannot make ends meet even though they are working. Working lower middle, these would be folks who basically are working to try to make ends meet, and they usually can, but sometimes they slip through, and if they lost that one form of income, they would definitely slip into poverty, or into working poor. Middle class, this is a big one because the spectrum is huge, but in this case, this refers to someone who works for their income on a regular basis and has a little bit of savings. And then we have professional working class, also sometimes called white collar, or professional class, and these would be folks who have salaried incomes that they're able to save with. And then we have owning class. Sometimes this is also called the ruling class, especially in like Marxist circles. And basically owning class, ironically, are the people who work the least usually. So just thinking about narratives, keep that in mind. Because they own so much, whether in the form of property or stocks or bonds or things like this, that they just accumulate excess income on income. Then we have SES. Does anyone know what that stands for? Right. So SES we also sometimes use as a stand-in for class, but it's actually a composite metric that's made up of 4 factors. We have income. So again, that's basically how much do you bring in a week, a month, a year, so to speak. Your occupation, like what's the quality of your work? Is it salaried? Is it wage-based? Is it, a professional space? Is it not? Education, this is what we're doing right here. So this is formal education in the eyes of institutional norms. And then neighborhood deprivation refers to the concentration in your geographical, sometimes this is also labeled as geography. And that just means in your area where you live, what's the percentage of people who are underemployed or unemployed. And then net worth, and again, I would just underline this word worth right here because we'll get into that a little bit later, but just kind of tag that, is what we own minus what we owe. So if I have a car that's worth $50,000, but I have $75,000 in student loans, then my net worth is negative $25,000. So then what is classism, right? We got to get together on the definition of this. Can I get someone to read this? Anybody? Fiona?
Classism is differential treatment based on social class or perceived social class. Classism is the systematic oppression of subordinated class groups to advantage and strengthen the dominant class groups. It's the systematic assignment of characteristics of worth and ability based on social class.
Great, thank you. And does anyone see anything in this part that looks familiar based on like 20 seconds ago? Worth, great, yeah. So this is basically assigning human value based on income and yeah, I guess how much money you make. It's also, this systematic nature is, this word is great, but also systemic. I would add to this because it shows that it manifests in different ways, such as individual attitudes and behaviors, systems of policies and practices that are set up to benefit the upper classes at the expense of the lower classes. And this is key too, because it puts wealth and poverty always in a seesaw. We really can't talk about one without talking about the other. And then finally, the culture and norms that support and perpetuate these systems. So this is key too, because without the cultural backing, you can't really have a reality, right? And deep cultural backing. So does anyone, especially public health folks out there, to see anything in these three types of manifestations of classism that sounds kind of like some kind of motto we use a lot? Anyone? All right, guys, freshen up, just kidding. That's the socio-ecological model, and basically classism, as you might imagine, like racism, like sexism, like all the isms, manifest across each of these. So we also have to get clear on our reality. How many people feel like they have a really good sense of the distribution of wealth in the US right now? Great, you do, okay, great. So, well, we're still gonna watch this video. And basically, just keep in mind how your body might be feeling as you watch this, what kind of thoughts are coming up for you. And just, yeah, be mindful, and we'll play this.
There's a chart I saw recently that I can't get out of my head. A Harvard business professor and economist asked more than 5,000 Americans how they thought wealth was distributed in the United States. This is what they said they thought it was. Dividing the country into 5 rough groups of the top, bottom, and middle 3 20% groups, they asked people how they thought the wealth in this country was divided. Then he asked them what they thought was the ideal distribution. And 92%, that's at least 9 out of 10 of them, said it should be more like this. In other words, more equitable than they think it is. Now that fact is telling, admittedly, the notion that most Americans know that the system is already skewed unfairly. But what's most interesting to me is the reality compared to our perception. The ideal is as far removed from our perception of reality as the actual distribution is from what we think exists in this country. So ignore the ideal for a moment. Here's what we think it is again. And here is the actual distribution. Shockingly skewed. Not only do the bottom 20% and the next 20%, the bottom 40% of Americans barely have any of the wealth. I mean, it's hard to even see them on the chart. But the top 1% has more of the country's wealth than 9 out of 10 Americans believe the entire top 20% should have. Mind-blowing. But let's look at it another way, because I find this chart kind of difficult to wrap my head around. Instead, let's reduce the 311 million Americans to just a representative 100 people. Make it simple. Here they are: teachers, coaches, firefighters, construction workers, engineers, doctors, lawyers, some investment bankers, a CEO, maybe a celebrity or two. Now let's line them up according to their wealth. Poorest people on the left, wealthiest on the right, just a steady row of folks based on their net worth. We'll color code them like we did before based on which 20% quintile they fall into. Now let's reduce the total wealth of the United States, which was roughly $54 trillion in 2009, to this symbolic pile of cash. And let's distribute it among our 100 Americans. Well, here's socialism, all the wealth of the country distributed equally. We all know that won't work. We need to encourage people to work and work hard to achieve that good old American dream and keep our country moving forward. So, here's that ideal we asked everyone about. Something like this curve. This isn't too bad. We've got some incentive, as the wealthiest folks are now about 10 to 20 times better off than the poorest Americans. But hey, even the poor folks aren't actually poor, since the poverty line has stayed almost entirely off the chart. We have a super healthy middle class with a smooth transition into wealth. And yes, Republicans and Democrats alike chose this curve. 9 out of 10 people, 92%, said this was a nice, ideal distribution of America's wealth. But let's move on. This is what people think America's wealth distribution actually looks like. Not as equitable, clearly, but for me, even this still looks pretty great. Yes, the poorest 20 to 30% are starting to suffer quite a lot compared to the ideal, and the middle class is certainly struggling more than they were, while the rich and wealthy are making roughly 100 times that of the poorest Americans, and about 10 times that of the still healthy middle class. Sadly, this isn't even close to the reality. Here is the actual distribution of wealth in America. The poorest Americans don't even register. They're down to pocket change, and the middle class is barely distinguishable from the poor. In fact, even the rich between the top 10 and 20 percentile are worse off. Only the top 10% are better off. And how much better off? So much better off that the top 2 to 5% are actually off the chart at this scale. And the top 1%, this guy, well, his stack of money stretches 10 times higher than we can show. Here's his stack of cash, restacked, all by itself. This is the top 1% we've been hearing so much about. So much green in his pockets that I have to give him a whole new column of his own, because he won't fit on my chart. 1% of America has 40% of all the nation's wealth. The bottom 80%, 8 out of every 10 people, or 80 out of these 100, only has 7% between them. And this has only gotten worse in the last 20 to 30 years. While the richest 1% take home almost a quarter of the national income today, in 1976 they took home only 9%, meaning their share of income has nearly tripled in the last 30 years. The top 1% own half the country's stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. The bottom 50% of Americans own only 0.5% of these investments, which means they aren't investing. They're just scraping by. I'm sure many of these wealthy people have worked very hard for their money. But do you really believe that the CEO is working 380 times harder than his average employee? Not his lowest paid employee, not the janitor, but the average earner in his company. The average worker needs to work more than a month to earn what the CEO makes in 1 hour. We certainly don't have to go all the way to socialism to find something that is fair for hardworking Americans. We don't even have to achieve what most of us consider might be ideal. All we need to do is wake up and realize that the reality in this country is not at all what we think it is.
Does anyone know how I get up into presentation mode? print. Sorry, do you know how to present? Let me see if I can redo it. Oh, there we go. Sorry. All right, so yeah, got it. So I have two questions for you guys. One is, how did that video make you feel? And the other one is, what information was new for you, and what information did you already know? You don't have to answer both. Anyone? Yeah?
I'll share that it makes me feel really guilty
Guilty.
for talking over the
Thank you. Someone else? Yeah.
Not from a public health perspective, but from a personal perspective, how much work I have to do to like unpack my baggage around class so that I can do it as class.
Thank you. Someone else? Yeah.
Interesting how like relatively equitable ideal distribution was, and I feel like that doesn't match up with so much of the rhetoric and voting behaviors and so many other things that we see. Like that was like actually I was happy that that was true, but I was also surprised because I feel like I haven't seen like manifestations of trying to work with that ideal.
Right. I'm glad you brought that up, because that was another question, is, does anyone see anything positive about this video? Yeah, Shokafe.
kind of building on that, I think what it suggests to me is that as a country, we're really unfamiliar with how things look. So that, we interpret that as a mismatch. And so to me, that suggests education would help.
Great. And how about one more? Shoot. Right. Right. Thank you. Right. Cool. Thanks, y'all. So we're going to deep dive into some of that a little bit more in a minute. But before we get there, since we are at a public health institution, we do have to figure out why this won't move forward. No. Oh,
It's on.
because of the video. Let's see if it works now. Oh yeah, okay, cool. So this video is great, right? But one thing that's really not addressed, and is super important to address because of intersectionality, is how this intersects with race, right? Especially because this series is about race and class. We have to really examine that as well. So who is familiar with this term, the racial wealth divide? Yeah. Do you want to give a little definition of it? Right. Exactly. Yeah, that's great. It's basically how race and class intersect with each other. So if we look at race only, we can see that white households, and this is annual income as opposed to that graphic in the video was showing like wealth over time, accumulated wealth, is far greater than Latino and Black households. But then we also have to add another layer of intersection, which is gender. So if we look at race and gender, the situation is even more bleak with, who's familiar with like, women only make 78 cents on the man's dollar, right? But what they're forgetting to say is that that's white women, right? Because white is seen as normative, right? So that's actually quite untrue when it comes to Latina and Black women who are making $200 and $100 or $100 and $200 respectively on white women's almost $16,000 annually. So that basically means at the end of 1 year, the profit that a Black woman might have is $200. Bleak, huh? Yeah. Someone say, ouch. Ouch. Hurts, right? Yeah. So all that said, that kind of paints a picture at this top level, right? But how does this actually show up, and especially talking about public health? Like, what does that look like? And why is it actually really dire that we work on classism as part of an institution, right? And as part of a field of that cares deeply about eliminating health disparities. If we go back to the socio-ecological model and start at the first tier, the self or personal, for all of you who are not familiar with that model, that basically just means anything involving selfhood and your individual relationship to health. We can talk about stress. So the dominant narrative is everybody gets stressed, right? Right? Everybody experiences stress. It's a universal reality. But this is kind of untrue if we look at it with a class analysis, because your brain responds to stress differently based on your economic background. So this is actually a child's brain on poverty. And basically, has anyone seen this before? I know there are some researchers here who talk about this a lot. Basically, if you're growing up in chronic poverty, your emotional reactivity spikes compared to your wealthier counterparts, and your emotional regulation goes down. And basically what researchers found is that, so if we have a scenario that, you know, is stress-inducing, like you're late to catch the bus and that's gonna make you late for school, and then that's gonna make your teachers mad at you, and so on and so forth, your reaction to that scenario is going to be more extreme versus your counterparts, and your ability to regulate and bring yourself back down to stasis is shortened. And this actually, there's a whole nother myth with class that, right, like the come up, right? So if you grow up in poverty, but by the time you're in your 30s, you're financially stable, then all that class stuff goes away. And that's a huge myth, because even though this is a child's brain on poverty, the effects of this actually get worse over time, even if you become financially stable, in the form of your telomeres shortening and you have synapse loss. So moving up the socio-ecological model to the interpersonal level, we can talk about safety. So again, dominant narrative, who's heard this? That's a dangerous neighborhood, and usually who's telling you that, and what kind of neighborhood are they referring to? I can't hear you. Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Yep. Poor neighborhoods, yeah. And are these poor neighborhoods in the middle of Arkansas, usually? Or do they have maybe a geographical component? Usually urban, right? Urban spaces. So, again, this is only partially true if we look at it with a class analysis. Because yes, while there is violence in neighborhoods of all varieties, what causes that violence is not talked about, right? So this is basically, these black bars here are middle income neighborhoods, and these 6 exposures are children who are living in those neighborhoods' experience of having that. So that was a mouthful. Basically, the white bars are the likelihood that a child living in that poor neighborhood is going to experience at least one of these, 2 of these, 3 of these, 4 of these, 5 of these, 6 of these. So you could say, hey, what about this black bar? More than 50% of middle-income kids are experiencing at least one of these, which might come in the form of like noise or child separation from family because of divorce, right? But what is really telling is down here, you see that the middle-income kids are barely represented at 5 or 6 different types of stress, right? And what you see more of is that children living in poverty are experiencing more of these cumulative stressors, right? Okay, so we're still going to keep going. Is this new information for you guys? Okay, somewhat? All right, that's good. We're going to go up to the community level and talk about systems, right? This is that, if we go back to the definition of classism, that systemic inequity piece. Who's heard this before? Right. And who, Mary, who is being referred to when you hear this? Uh-huh. Anyone else? No? Okay. Chronically unemployed, yeah. So basically, again, this is kind of yes, Emmy? Absolutely. Yeah, people who express any kind of discontent with their situation and reality, right? Absolutely. So this, again, is pretty mythical when we look at it with a class analysis. This is an infographic of the average amount of time spent trying to fill out a SNAP application, which is basically food stamps or federal assistance for food for a family. So 2.4 trips to the food stamp office. This is even before filling out the application. 1.5 trips to other locations to get necessary pieces of information. And this is post-internet. This is not like 80s, 70s, 60s data. This is very recent. 6.1 hours just to complete the thing. And then here's what's really telling for me is 39% of those with earnings, which is people who actually have income, had to miss work to fill out this application and get it there on time. And 9% of them had to incur dependent care expenses, so that's basically child care expenses. So I don't know about you all, but this sounds like a lot of work, right? Doesn't that seem like a lot of work? But what's different about it is that this isn't valued as labor, right? The labor of trying to make ends meet by different means other than just making income is not valued as a form of labor. The emotional labor that goes into this, the stigma that goes into having to get a public benefit, is not valued as labor. So when we think about basically how time is spent and whose labor is being valued, you can see that we have a lot of mythologies around that as well. So basically all of that deduces down to this reality that it's expensive to be poor, right? But we don't talk about that. So just a few more public health things. Poverty is a 7-fold predictor of lack of school readiness by kindergarten. So that means before you even enter your first formal year of education, you're 7 times less likely to be prepared than your wealthier counterparts. Increases your risk of physical illness in the form of things like coronary heart disease. Increases mood disorders, depression, and substance abuse. And this last one comes from a study of 7.1 million people worldwide. So this is a huge analysis that The Lancet just recently published. When they controlled for all other factors, they found that poverty resulted in a 2.1 year, on average, reduction in life expectancy. Which, if anyone's seen the map of New Orleans based on neighborhood, you know that the Storeville area, based on uptown, there's a 25-year life expectancy discrepancy between, half a mile that way and 3 miles that way. But there's another flip side, right? This is where we don't talk about the wealth problem, which is that it pays to be rich. This is really interesting to me. Kids from the top 1% of families are 9 times more likely to invent something in their lifetime. Why do you think, than any other family from any other SES background? Why do you think that might be? Can you say more? Thank you. Yeah.
Also, if they need like a Bunsen burner in their house or whatever material to practice something, they just ask for it and it comes.
Absolutely. Will. For sure. Fiona?
Melissa might feel more comfortable taking risks because like inventing and like entrepreneurship is an inherently risky thing, and they know that they have a social safety net, and so that they can take those kinds of risks.
Right. And then one thing I would just add is back to that stress slide. Your brain, when your brain is chronically stressed, it's really hard to focus on anything else except reducing that stress, right? So when your brain is not stressed, you have more brain space to actually think about in things like inventing something. Also, you have, speaking of stress, an increased ability to just cope with everyday life stressors as well as acute stressors like car crashes, loss of a job, things like that. Increased leisure time. This is huge when we say time is money, right? Money is time, time is money. The amount of free time you have really affects your outcomes in life in terms of health and having a high quality of life. And then finally, handouts. This language is very charged, right? People often say things like SNAP benefits are handouts, right? But wealthy people get a lot of handouts, especially if they know what they're doing. Like, I just put one example, our frequent flyer miles, right? Like, if you're flying all the time because you're wealthy, because you can afford to travel, or because you have a high-paying job that makes you travel all the time, every time you're flying, you're accumulating miles so that you're just flying for free. And none of this stuff is talked about as a handout. So despite all this, I feel like we remain very classified about class. As Jen said earlier, a lot of like unpacking, I feel like is a very common thing that I hear when I talk about class of like, wow, I had no idea, or I need to analyze my own class situation. So if everyone could take out their phones for a minute, that would be great. We're gonna jump into some discussion. And basically, I'd like you to text Kendra Davis 439 to 22333. And once you've done that, just text whatever you want to respond to the question, why do you think we remain classified about class? And when I say classified, I just mean silent, including in social justice spaces, including in spaces that were supposedly very equitable or trying to achieve equity. Does that make sense, everyone? Instructions? Has anyone submitted a response yet? All right, I just want to make sure it's working. Yeah, and you can text it. Oh, no, basically just answer in a text message and then send it to 22333 after you've already sent Kendra Davis 439.
But it'll show up on.
It'll show up on here.
De-identified.
Yeah. De-identified, yeah. Has anyone submitted a response yet? Oh, really?
Mine says you joined Kendra Davis' session.
You tried to submit something, Christina? All right. Oh, no. Sorry, guys. I should have done that before. Okay, can you try again for folks who put something in? Great. Yes. Thank you. Privilege. I'm just going to start reading them out loud. People who are successful attribute it to the American dream, but they forget the privilege they have been born with, parentheses, white privileged. So that's where you see the intersection of race and class. A lot of projecting situational and dispositional going on from both sides, especially the richer. Privilege. The richest are hoarding and protecting their wealth and status. Embarrassment. people, mostly upper-class whites, do not want to address the history of racist white supremacist structures and policies that still exist today. Self-protection and little to no empathy. Because class structure and inequitable distribution benefits most of us in this room. Yes, yes it does. Guilt and selfishness, shame. Does anyone feel comfortable elaborating on either what they responded or what you're seeing up here? Or do you see any themes that are coming up over and over? I can name one, privilege. I've seen that word several times. Somebody else? Chokfe?
This isn't mine, but I see society's tight grip on the meritocracy myth, and I think that that's really key in this country as to why we don't talk about it. Because if we did, we would have to first burst the bubble in this myth, which is what the American dream is. If we work hard enough, we'll achieve it. And so it requires dismantling so much of our understanding of the world and our society that it's like too big.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. Anybody else? Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Quick note on that. That's an interesting point you bring up. Since I've been kind of diving into some classism organizing spaces, so trying to undo classism with groups of people here in New Orleans, I found that a really interesting thing is that folks from lower SES backgrounds compare down. So they usually say, okay, yeah, I'm struggling, but at least I have a roof over my head, right? People from higher SES usually compare up. Yeah, I might have 5 cars, but that guy over there, he has 10 cars. So that's an interesting thing in trying to kind of debunk some of this stuff. Yeah. Right. And you bring up another great point. I mean, thinking about the intersection of race, gender, and class, what is the term that got really popularized by a specific president a few presidencies ago that referred to, yes. Right. Can you say it louder and maybe define what that is?
Welfare queen.
Uh-huh.
And it's a thing that doesn't exist where, I think the stereotype of black single mothers who abuse the system.
Right. And do you know why it was popularized? Why did this particular presidency Reagan lift that up?
Reagan didn't want to have entitlement programs.
Mm-hmm.
And I imagine his folks created that sort of myth so that people wouldn't want to have entitlement.
Yeah. And also to deepen the construction of whiteness, right? Because if that's the other over there and you're not that, if you're a poor white person getting SNAP benefits, you're not a welfare queen. It's racialized. If you racialize it, then you can distance it, right? Yeah. Yeah.
That's kind of the point that I want to follow is racism as a concept is so ingrained and so difficult to overcome. When you want to start talking about healthcare today right now, many people vote against their own interests.
Absolutely.
They apply it down.
Mm-hmm.
They see that they're going to lose benefits. Only now are they realizing that, oh, it's me that is vulnerable, not just others. And it's really difficult. When you look at that video, you see that there's a vulnerable population there that wakes up with all the things separate circumstances, but they divide themselves so narrowly that they don't see the issue as common.
Right. Right. Or that they don't see themselves in it at all.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yep. Yep.
I think the point that you made before about people like lower class people looking down, and I think like as Black people, we've been taught like, you know, you might not have this, but at least you're not like them, or at least you're not like that. To kind of get to see the positive side of Black people, like I said, I mean, the Florida Phillips index we got was very complaint, and historically, most people if you speak out because you don't have power, nothing gets changed anyway.
Right.
So it's like, oh, you're lazy, shut up. And
Mhm.
that's it. So it's like, you'd rather just work hard, do whatever you have to do, and get what you can because talking, complaining, nothing comes out of that.
Right.
You have no power.
Yeah.
And I think even like the welfare things and the healthcare system, with the Affordable Care Act, most people didn't know that, like, you know, most people who are on welfare and receive food stamps are for white people. That's statistic. I don't know the statistic.
Yeah.
It's
Mhm.
significantly more. And it's just crazy, like the other end, and I mean, even if it was going on of racism, how deep, embedded it is in society, and it's much to kind of and target that and have like a conversation and speak on so people actually take issue knowledge, embrace it, and share it.
Right. Absolutely. I think you get to a great point. And just quickly on that, I think it also gets to the piece about caucusing, which is basically in organizing spaces, you kind of caucus out by your own identity. So I think around class it's super important. So wealthy folks talk to wealthy folks because they have that power and they're going to listen to people like them. Folks from other backgrounds talk to their folks because it's a different set of problems, even if the ultimate goal is the same, which is to eliminate class inequity for all people, right? Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Sharon. Right. Mhm. Right. Mhm. Right. Thank you. I'm glad you said that too because it gets to this piece about culture change, right? And what kind of education are we doing and why? I'm going to skip over that for now, but we can go back after. If we go to this highest tier, right, this is the one part of the socio-ecological model we didn't talk about, which is the macro level system. These are the biggest things, right? The big bang, like culture, policies and programs, international trade, like all of these macro level things, the biggest we can get. We have to talk about culture change, right? Because I don't want y'all to leave here being like, I'm so sad, there's nothing we can do, that was a waste of time, because we can change things. And I think it starts with exactly what you just said, which is reframing, right? So who's heard this? Yeah. Anyone want to elaborate who told them that and in what context? Will? Totally. Yeah, it becomes dominant, like this dream. Like, how many people have told you the American dream in that phrase exactly to your face and have explained exactly what the American dream is? Or is it just weaved into the fabric of our everyday life, right, so deeply? Yeah, this implies a type of permanence that is actually, again, very mythical. And they want us to think it's permanent because they don't want us to do anything about it, right? And I'm talking about people from all ends of the class spectrum. We can change things. Again, with reframing, I think talking about assets, risk, resilience, worth, value, and now I'm going to add welfare to that. These are coded words that come with certain things. So like assets usually means what do you have? How many cars do you have? How many properties do you own? Things like that. Risk, who's familiar with the phrase at risk? Yeah, at risk of what, right? Who's at risk? Who's at risk? reframing that. Resilience. This is kind of also to make sure that we don't burn out, right? And make sure that we don't fall over because this reality is so bad. Talking about what is resilient about your community, what is great about your community. Yeah, Emmy. Totally. Exactly. Totally. I think you get to this narrative that prevention pays, right? They often say, especially in public health, that you have to prove things in numbers, right? And I think that that's, unfortunate because you can't prove something that never happened. But you can kind of predict those things, right? And that's what we hear a lot of here. So I think there's ways to kind of lift up those narratives of how we can save money and put that, recycle that back into the next generation. And I'm also really glad you brought up tax, because it's not sexy, right, to talk about taxes, unless you're a nerd like that. I think they're kind of cool. Whatever. But I think if you come from any type of wealth, right, and if you don't know, I would strongly encourage to really dig down and figure out where do I stand on this spectrum, It's complicated because it's not just rich and poor and middle class, and the middle class is so coded for safety, right? You're okay if you're middle class, as long as you're not the wealthy, right? Those are the people who are demonized, and also, conversely, poor folks are also demonized. So if you come from wealth, even if you're not as an independent person wealthy, it's really important to examine that and to actually join community to examine that. Anything that we need to do to change culture, we can't do in silos, right? On that same point, moving money is key, right? But if anyone, I come from a fundraising background, professional fundraising. The world of philanthropy is so effed up. It has all these norms of creating cycles of dependency and aid, especially if you bring it to a global context. It's really not good. But there are ways to do that and that are more equitable, right? And a lot of it is the tax structure, because the taxes are how the government gets money. And yes, we can say that under this current administration, we have all sorts of problems of who's going to actually benefit from those taxes. But, Shun, to your point of welfare, one of the biggest welfares that, if welfare just means public assistance that wealthy people get are tax breaks, right? So if you come from wealth, you can actually advocate to say, hey, tax me. I come from wealth. I believe in the value of all people and dignity, and I value everyone's labor. And that's really important in a world that's saying that the only people that are advocating, that wealthy people only advocate for tax breaks for themselves. And then the last part about this is also call in other wealthy people. So that means kind of get your people, so to speak. Find them. There's probably people in this room. There's a group here called Resource Generation that I work with, and basically their goal is the redistribution of land, wealth, and power. And they work with millennials who self-identify as having wealth, so that's 18 to 35-year-olds. If you want more information about that, ask me. And then finally, learn from and follow working class movement leaders. Here in New Orleans, it's a predominantly working class city, about 85%. We have a lot of people who are envisioning right now what we could do with City Hall's $600 million budget, right? And they're having meetings. They have one this Saturday, or next Saturday from 1 to 4. There's a lot of ways to get involved and follow their leadership and kind of take a step back and humble yourself if that's not your background. And then I want to leave you with this, because that was pretty depressing, right? But this graphic shows a reality that we could manifest again. This basically shows those quintiles. Actually, I think this is the top 5% and this is the top 1%. It shows that from 1947 to 1979, yes, there was discrepancies between these wealth brackets, but they grew a lot closer to each other, right? And from 1979 to 2008, we've grown way apart. And basically, the rich keep getting richer and the poor keep getting poorer to the point where the bottom 20% is actually at negative wealth. But we can, if we really want to, maintain, go back to, restore this reality and actually a better version of it. So that's all I have. If anyone has any questions, let me know.